Welcome back. This is the third session of Interpreting the Nazir with Mishnah Tractate Nazir. Welcome back to people joining us on Zoom and Facebook Live. This class, like the rest of our Mishnah offerings, is being taught in memory of Rifka Rosenwein, Zikrona Livracha. Today we have the pleasure of learning with Rabbi Silber. Sources will be from the Mishnah on Nazir will be shared on screen. And with that, Rabbi Silber, who needs, I believe, needs no further introduction.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we are looking at some of the mishnayot in Masechet Nazir. Actually, there are many mishnayot, and in a few weeks that we have together, we're looking at a few of them. Get some sense of what the Mishnah is trying to do. We know the Torah has a chapter about Nazir, and the Mishnah is both, in a sense, interpreting what the Torah says, but also takes this Nazir in many different directions and presents us with a particular view of the Nazir. It's one of the challenges of studying Mishnah is to figure out at its core, what is the Mishnah really trying to present us with? How is the Mishnah framing, one might say reframing the Nazir? So let me say before I start, I simply want to point out once again about the study of Mishnah, and yes, in memory of Rifka Rosenwein, we tend to engage in a major Mishnah project. We want to start a Mishnah Yomi to get people to learn Mishnah, and Drisha will help with that process. It's interesting that the Rambam, of course, one of the really significant, one of the great teachers of Judaism and of Jews over the centuries. So the Rambam has several major works that he wrote, major Jewish works. He wrote some non-Jewish stuff. As a kid, he wrote, I think, a treatise on logic. But he's known for essentially two major works, which are, first of all, his compendium of all the laws of the Talmud, all of them, and he calls that Mishnah Torah. He called it Mishnah Torah. Of course, he has his philosophical work, the Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed. Those are the two most well-known works that the Rambam has. But the two other things I want to mention that the Rambam wrote. First of all, he has an incredibly interesting book called Sefer HaMitzvot, which he writes about as a kind of introduction to the Mishnah Torah. If you saw the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, he divides it into 14 books, and each book has chapters, sections. It's the organization of the Rambam, organizational ability is beyond belief. In any event, before each of the chapters, he writes as an introduction, these are the mitzvot that will appear in this section, positive commandments and the negative commandments. So the Rambam wrote a separate book, actually, short book, called Sefer HaMitzvot, the book of mitzvot. And in this book, the Rambam gives his list of the 613 commandments, the 248 positive commandments, and the 365 negative commandments. But before he does that, this is very Rambam-like, he writes in his introduction, before I give you the list, let's determine what qualifies as a mitzvah. And in determining that, he has 14 principles, 14 ikarim, about how we determine whether something counts as a mitzvah or not, in the list of 613. So he says he's writing this as an introduction to the Mishnah Torah. And it's a great book because apart from the inherent idea that actually the Rambam is trying to define what is a mitzvah, what makes it in particular interesting is that this book, that there's a critique of the book that is written on the book by the Ramban, Nachmanides, Clash of the Titans, and it's quite amazing, actually. But the point I want to make is that the Rambam, so that's what he wrote. Then he wrote something else when he was younger. The Rambam writes a perush on all of the Mishnah. Perush ha-mishnaiot l'Rambam. First thing he writes, before he gets to the Mishnah Torah, he calls his work the Mishnah Torah, and he writes, by introduction to the Mishnah Torah, to the great halachic work of the Rambam, the great compendium, says, I am writing this in the language of the Mishnah. It's written in mishnaic Hebrew. I mention all this to point out the extent to which the Rambam felt that the key to understanding so-called Torah Shebaal Peh is actually the Mishnah. And I mention this simply as putting out there that the study of Mishnah is really, I think, incredibly important if we really want to get a real sense of what this oral tradition is really about. So the Rambam clearly believed that. And I'll make one other point about the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah. Perush HaMishnaic Rambam, that when somebody writes a commentary on the Mishnah, it certainly leads to the possibility that for the Rambam, and certainly for others, that the Rambam felt that the Mishnah can be explained without necessarily the Gemara's explanation. See, the Gemara, the Talmud, the vast Talmud, is a commentary on the Mishnah to some extent. It takes it in different directions, has separate questions. One of the big questions in the world of academia, certainly, is whether the explanations that the Gemara gives for the Mishnah are the only possible explanations, or are there other ways to interpret the Mishnah apart from the Gemara? When somebody writes a commentary on the Mishnah, it always suggests to us that that person felt, possibly, that the Mishnah can be seen in and of itself without necessarily always assuming that what the Gemara says about the Mishnah is actually the initial intention of the Mishnah. That's one of the big questions in the study of Mishnah. I put it out there without addressing it at this point. Okay, let's get back to our study of Mishnah. So let's begin with the first chapter once again, Mishnah number 3. Chapter 1, Mishnah 3. And the Mishnah says the following. Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. What does that mean? It means that if somebody says, I want to be a Nazir, Hareini Nazir, right? Hareini Nazir. I'm becoming a Nazir. There are different ways, as we saw already the past 2 weeks, to accept upon oneself the Nazirite vow. That's the question: how explicit must you be? Is slang sufficient? Are words that intimate Nazirut without saying it's sufficient? It's sufficient to pick out one particular prohibition of Nazirut, etc., etc. That's one question. But in the Torah, what is clear in the Chumash, you open up chapter 6 of Bamidbar, the Torah spends half the time of that chapter, maybe more than half, talks about how one finishes the vow of the Nazir. You say, I am a Nazir, and the Torah then speaks many verses at the end of chapter 6. What do you do when the Nazirite vow is completed? So there you bring sacrifices, 3 sacrifices. If you successfully complete the Nazirite vow, you bring 3 sacrifices, and you cut your hair. Afterwards, you're permitted to drink wine. Fine, we'll get to that. But the Torah does not say how long is the vow, and presumably it would depend on the person's statement. One could say, I will be a Nazirite for 6 months, I'll be a Nazirite for 7 years, I'll be a Nazirite for, sounds like for 2 days. It doesn't say in the Torah. But the Mishnah, which is, among other things, certainly has elements of a code, if it's not a full-fledged code. So codes like precision. They like to have very fixed amounts, and not to leave it up to, could have said whatever one says is valid. But the Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says, Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom, if you don't specify. If you don't specify, you are a Nazir for 30 days. Now, where did this 30-day idea come from? So what's very interesting is, first of all, we do have in our tradition, in the Gemara, other things that are 30 days if unspecified. In particular, what comes to mind is the Gemara in Bava Batra, Stam Halva Shloshim Yom. If I say, please lend me money, you say, okay, and you give me some money as a loan. I am obligated to repay it. Another question is, what is the length of the loan? We didn't specify. So give me a loan. I want to borrow some money. Okay, here's money. Here's $100. When does it come due? So the Gemara says in Bava Batra, Stam Halva Shloshim Yom, an unspecified loan is for 30 days. Doesn't say why 30 days. There's no particular source for that. But the assumption is that's what people assume. It's not just a couple of days, and it's not a very long time. Of course, remembering, of course, that loans in the Torah, in the Talmud, at least loans to fellow Jews, there's no interest being charged. So it's a kind of gift, as it were. It has to be repaid. Now, when it comes to the Nazirite, we have a similar, here we have in the Mishnah, Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. If you don't specify the Nazirite vow lasts for 30 days. It's interesting that the Gemara actually gives two reasons for this, two so-called sources. There is no source per se, but one of the sources that the Gemara suggests is a kind of source that appears no other place in the entire Talmud. The source of the Gemara is fascinating. The Torah says about the Nazir, Kadosh Yihiyeh. The Nazir shall be Kadosh, Yihiyeh. Says the Talmud, Yihiyeh b'gematria is 30. In other words, the letters have a numerical value. Whenever that began, who knows? But the Gemara says that a yud is 10 and a hey is 5, and the yud is 10 and the hey is 5, 15 and 15 is 30, that's the source. That's according to one view. It's the only place in the entire Talmud there's a gematria source for halacha. Interestingly, the Rambam, when the Rambam, in his code, he has a whole section on Hilchot Nazir, and the Rambam gives a different source. Maybe the Rambam wasn't crazy about gematrias, I suspect. Rambam says, halacha. What does it mean, halacha? Halacha in the Rambam means it is a tradition. Sometimes it's called halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Talmud knows of things that are derived. There are statements in the Torah. Then there are rules that are derived from kind of exegesis, different principles of exegesis. Say Reshava, Kal Vachomer, Binyanav, etc., Klal Uprat. And then there are traditions, which are presumed to go back to Sinai. It's called Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So there's nothing in the text. It's an oral tradition, but this oral tradition has a kind of similar status to Torah law. The Rambam says that the idea that the Nazir is for 30 days, he says halacha. Halacha. It's interesting that in the case in Tractate Nazir, and the Rambam cites them, we come across this idea of halacha on quite a few different occasions. That's the Rambam. It's a halacha of stam nazirut shloshim yom. Having said that, there is something else we have to take into account when it comes to the 30-day idea of the Nazir. And that is that what distinguishes the Nazir in the Chumash, and certainly in the story of Shimshon, it's a question: what is the main character? What is the main rule that distinguishes the Nazir? So there are three things the Nazir primarily has. That's the 6th chapter of the Mishnah, Shalosha Minin, but the 3 Isurim. But one of them is that the Nazir is not allowed to cut his or her hair. Not only not allowed to cut his or her hair, tar lo yavar rosho, forbidden to cut hair, but on top of that, the Torah said in chapter 6, and speaking about the Nazir, kadosh yeh, the Nazir is holy, gadel pera sa'ar rosho. The hair of the Nazir should grow pera, means wildly. So it's not just a negative commandment not to cut the hair, but it's a positive commandment of kadosh yeh gadel pera sa'ar rosho. Maybe the Rambam interprets that's what the gematria means, that kadosh yeh, in as much as gadel pera. And what does pera mean? You have to let your hair grow long or wild. How long is that? So the Gemara says, en pera pachot mishloshim yom. Long hair is a minimum of 30 days. We'll see this later on in the Mishnah. That's related to stam nazirut shloshim yom, presumably. That's not just the halacha in a certain sense, but the halacha says that it's related to the idea of the hair growing long, and especially since the Torah said, kadosh yeh gadel pera sarosho, the Nazir is holy. Sounds like in as much as the Nazir is not permitted to cut hair. So that's the din, first of all, stam nazirut shloshim yom. Now I want to point out that this rule in the Mishnah of stam nazirut shloshim yom is actually more central than one might imagine. Sounds like, okay, you didn't specify the time, it's 30 days. But actually, the Mishnah takes it way beyond this. And I want to mention two things in the Mishnah. First of all, in the continuation of the Mishnah we're looking at, and I'll stop in a couple of minutes to take comments or questions. But the Mishnah continues, Stam Nazirut Shoshim Yom, Amar Hareini Nazir Achat Gedolah, Hareini Nazir Achat Katana, Afilu Mikana Sof Olam, Nazir Shoshim Yom. So the next statement in the Mishnah is that if you don't specify the days, I want to be a Nazir for a long time. I want to be a Nazir for a short time. Achat Gedolah v'Achat Katana. Says the Mishnah, you're a Nazir for 30 days. So Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom is taken in a very serious way. If you don't specify the time, a long time, a short time, what does it mean long and short? Who knows? But you are Nazir for 30 days. So there's a very specific, it's like we expect, there's a rule. Nazirus is 30 days, unless specified otherwise. And now, that's one interesting feature of this of Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. Let's continue with the Mishnah and see a second interesting feature of this rule. Hareini Nazir Yom Echad. Hareini Nazir Sha'ah Achat. Hareini Nazir Achat Umechsa. Hareini Nazir Shtayim. If the person said, I want to be a Nazir for, well, let's start the first part. I want to be a Nazir for a day. I want to be a Nazir for an hour. Right? Hareini Nazir Achat. I'm sorry. Harei Nazir b'yom echad. Harei Nazir b'sha'ah achat. Harei Nazir achat b'mech. The person said, I want to be a Nazir and a day. I want to be a Nazir and an hour. I want to be a Nazir and a half. Harei zeh Nazir shtayim. This person is the Nazir twice. He's twice 30. Because Harei Nazir is 30 days. And then if you say, I want to be Nazir for 1 day, for 1 hour, for 1 minute, whatever, you are a Nazir, but not for an hour. You're a Nazir for 30 days. This is part of the rule of Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. In other words, you are a Nazir consecutively. You're not a Nazir for 60 days. You're a Nazir for 30 days. And then you're a Nazir again for another 30 days. Now, what is the difference between being a Nazir for 60 days or being a Nazir for 2 sets of 30 days? Well, there are many differences, but here's one simple difference. That the question is, when is the Nazirut finished? We'll discuss this question. Because on one hand, you could say, well, if I'm a Nazir for 30 days, at the end of 30 days, I have completed Nazirut, I have fulfilled my vow. That's certainly one way to understand it. But then there's another way to understand it. Because at the end of the Nazirut, it doesn't just end by itself. The Nazir has to bring sacrifices and also cut the Nazir's hair. So the question is, big question, one of the big questions anyway, is, are the sacrifices that one brings at the end of the vow considered part of the vow? They certainly are mandatory. If you don't bring the sacrifices, or at least one of the sacrifices, we'll see it's dispute in the Mishnah, the Nazir has not terminated. And if it doesn't terminate, you're still a Nazir. And for example, it can be broken. You'll be forced to start all over again if you come in contact with the dead, come in contact with the corpse. That breaks your Nazirut, and you have to start all over again. So in the particular case over here, if it's just a 60-day Nazirut, you're Nazir for 60 days. At the end of 60 days, you bring your sacrifices, cut your hair, and that's it. But if you're Nazir twice, 30 plus 30, that means 30 plus the sacrifices, plus cutting hair, and you start over again with another 30 days. In any event, this is a new rule. I say, I want to be Nazir for 1 day. No, you're a Nazir for 30 days. That's part of the rule of Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. Okay. Now, that's if you said Stam. But what if you said, and the Mishnah continues, Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yom v'Sha'achat. I say, I want to be a Nazir for 30 days and 1 hour. Nazir Shloshim v'Echad Yom. Then the rule is, says the Mishnah, you are a Nazir for 31 days. She'ein Nazirim l'sha'ot. The point is, if you specify the days, I want to be a Nazir for 30 days plus an hour. Then the rule is you're a Nazir for 31 days. Hours don't count. Days. It's got to be days and not hours. There's no halachic significance to hours. But you're not two Nazirim because you specify the days. But if I said I want to be a Nazir plus an hour, then you're a Nazir twice. to Nazirut of 30 days. Now, this is the Mishnah, chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. But now we have another Mishnah that is very interesting. And before we get to that Mishnah, which introduces us to another concept that we find in the Mishnah and elsewhere, before we get to that, let me just stop for a moment. If anybody has any questions about anything I've said so far.
You can also ask in chat, or if you're an attendee, you can raise your hand and I'll let you speak.
Okay, if there are no questions, I'll just continue. Comments or
I have
questions?
one quick question.
Go ahead, speak, please.
Okay, when you're going to be a Nazirite for 30 days plus 1 day, the difference, the way you say it versus when you add echad, but it actually means when you say it that way, it's a whole nother month. What's the difference between those two?
Right. If you say I'm a
Right.
Nazir and an hour, you didn't specify, if you don't specify the time, you're a Nazir for 30 days, no matter what. If you say, I want to be a Nazir for a really long time in an hour, you're a
30
Nazir
days.
for 30 days, and then the hour is actually a new 30 days.
Okay, right.
You're a Nazir
I
30
got
and 30, because that's the point. Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom has two different aspects to it. One is an unspecified is 30, and the other is, and the other is less than 30 is also 30. In other words,
Yes.
it's not just, if you say 1 hour, 1 day, 2 days and 37 minutes, you're a Nazir for 30 days. That's
Right.
the rule. It's a rule. You know, the Mishnah likes rules. Law codes have rules. So that's very important.
Yes.
The rules are very important. That's fine. So that's one element of this business. And the difference between making an unspecified statement, I want to be a Nazir, that's 30 days. Say I want to be a Nazir for 30 days, that's also 30 days. But we'll get to the next Mishnah, in chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. And here we have a very, very interesting distinction between the 30-day Nazir who says 30 days and the 30-day Nazir who says, I want to be a Nazir. So they both are 30 days. But the Mishnah in chapter 3, Mishnah 1, has a very interesting distinction, which is relevant in other areas of halacha. So let's take a look at this. Chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. Okay, I'll read the Mishnah. Chapter 3, Mishnah 1. Misha Amar, Hareini Nazir. Someone said, I want to be a Nazir. Hareini Nazir. Okay, I'm a Nazir. Migaleach Yom Shloshim V'Echad. Then the Nazir will shave on the 31st day. By the way, when the Mishnah talks about shaving, because the Nazir cuts the hair upon the completion of the vow, but typically in the Mishnah, when they talk about giluach of shaving, they're referring not just to the shaving, but to also the bringing of the sacrifices. Often in the Mishnah, they're taking that for granted. The shaving comes together with the 3 sacrifices one brings at the conclusion of the vow. So if I said, I'm a Nazir for 30 days, and on the 31st day, that's when I shave my head, and that's when I bring my sacrifices. Right. The Mishnah continues. What about if I didn't cut my hair on the 30th day, a 31st day, but I cut my hair on the 30th day? Says the Mishnah, if I shaved on the 30th day, and presumably that means, let's say it means the sacrifices as well. I bring my sacrifices and I shave on the 30th day. I didn't wait till the 31st day. On the 30th day, Yotza, then that's fine. If I did it on that day, whether I should do it then or not, but if I did it, Yotza means I have fulfilled. Let's say I have fulfilled my obligation. My Nazirite vow was over. I can go home and I can drink wine, and I can and I can go to the cemetery or whatever it is, because I'm not a Nazir anymore. That's when I said Hareini Nazir. Continues the Mishnah. Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yom. But if the person said, I want to be a Nazir for 30 days, Im gilach liyom shloshim lo yotza. But if I said I want to be in Nazir for 30 days, I mentioned 30 days, and then I brought my sacrifices on the 30th day, I cut my hair on the 30th day. No. Lo yotza, I have not fulfilled the Nazirite vow. And in point of fact, if I actually did that and cut my hair on the 30th day in this case, I would have to observe a new 30 days because because the Nazir always has to observe, it's not over, and you cut your hair has to grow for 30 days. So what happened in that situation, I would have to start all over again. Now, let's understand this. Why is it the case? Let's start with this. The assumption of the Mishnah is that if I said I'm a Nazir for 30 days, since even if I didn't say 30 days, I would be a Nazir for 30 days, it must mean that when I said I'm a Nazir for 30 days, what I'm really saying is I'm a Nazir for a full 30 days. That's because otherwise there's no reason to say that. You're always a Nazir for 30 days. So I want to add in my way to say Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yom, then I mean I'm a Nazir for the full 30 days. And if I took that vow, at the end of the day, it's a vow. If I made that commitment that I have to be, that I'm a Nazir for the full 30 days, and I can only bring the sacrifices, cut my hair on the 31st day. But if I said I'm a Nazir, so I am a Nazir for 30 days, but in that case, if I shaved on the 30th day, Yotza. Now the question is, what is that about? Here we come across a very, very interesting halacha that probably many of us are familiar with in a different context. It comes up in the Talmud in minimally two other places. The concept is called Miksat Hayom Kekulo. Miksat Hayom, part of the day counts as the entire day. Now, what does it mean part of the day counts as the entire day? Here's where many of us are familiar with this rule. It comes up, and it comes up as a practical matter all the time in terms of Shiva, in terms of mourning, Shiva and Shloshim. The 7-day mourning period we call Shiva, and the 30-day mourning period we call Shloshim. So if somebody is sitting Shiva, okay, means you're counting the 7 days of mourning, and the mourner typically gets up on the 7th day in the morning, morning, not M-O-U-R. The person gets up in the morning. Why does the person get up in the morning? The 7th day, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Sunset is 8 o'clock at night. Why are we getting up in the morning? So the principle is Miksat Hayom Kekulo. Part of the day counts as the entire day. Now, that's one area where we have this. The other area where we seem to have it is in Nazir. The person says, I'm a Nazir. You're a Nazir for 30 days. But if you brought sacrifices and cut your hair on the 30th day, you have completed the Nazirite vow, even though it's early in the morning and the days for another 10, 12 hours. Doesn't matter. That's called Miksat Hayom Kekulo. It comes up in one other situation in the Talmud, which has to do with what the so-called Zava, or the Zav and the Zava, which has to do with it's a woman who bleeds during when it's unexpected. It's kind of illness. It's presented as a kind of illness. It's not a regular nida. But in terms of a Zava, if there's bleeding during a certain period of the month in her cycle, then she has to count out 7 days. And on the 7th day, she brings a sacrifice. So that sacrifice can be brought on the 7th day. She doesn't have to wait actually till the 7 days are completed, because we have the principle of Miksat Hayom Kekulo. Those are the 3 areas in the Talmud where we have this principle. Now, Miksat Hayom Kekulo, by the way, we can't get into this, but it's actually a very interesting idea, because the next Mishnah actually tells us something quite fascinating about Miksat Hayom Kekulo. Now, by the way, when do we say Miksat Hayom Kekulo? Shabbos is very long this time of year. It's getting longer in the summer. It ends maybe 8:39, 9:15. So maybe I should get up on Shabbos morning. Maybe I'll go to shul, whatever, have a little food, and then I'll say, something. It's already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a long day. I'm going to apply the principle of Miksat Hayom Kekulo. Part of the day counts as the whole day, so we'll make Havdalah and whatever. So no one ever said such a thing. I'm not that I'm familiar with. So the point is, Yom Kippur, it's a long fast, So let's 10:30 in the morning. I've had enough. Mitzat Yom Kikulo. No, we don't say that. So when do you say Mitzat Yom Kikulo? So it seems that you say it primarily in cases where you're counting the days. You're counting the days. You're counting out 30 days. That's what it sounds like. So you can count the 30. Like we have Sfiras Omer. We're saying the Omer now. We count it at night, right? You're counting it on the day. Today is the 28th day of the Omer. So the point is, the counting takes place anytime during the day. So that's the idea of Mitzat Yom Kikulo. So that's what comes up, counting out 7 days of Shiva. But it doesn't apply where a day is a holy day. You don't say part of the day counts as the whole day. What's interesting, by the way, that the question is, let's say, for example, let's say in the following case, let's say the next Mishnah, Mishnah Bet, just to give some sense of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah has broken up into different sections, but there is also something about Mishnah in general, that the Mishnah is, when you're studying Mishnah, and certainly Gemara, you're looking at the big picture, and you're seeing how rules connect to each other. So, for example, in chapter 3, Mishnah number 2, Misha Nazar Shtei Naziriyot. Suppose a person took upon oneself two Nazirite terms. I want to be a Nazir, I want to be a Nazir. As we had before, I want to be a Nazir in 1 hour. So you're a Nazir for 2 consecutive 30-day periods. Okay. So then, person this is 2 consecutive Stam Nazirot. It's Mishnah 3, chapter 2. Misha Nazar Shtei Naziriyot. Migalechet HaRishona Yom Shloshim B'Yachad. V'et HaShniya Yom Shishim B'Yachad. So the first time you cut your hair is on the 31st day, right? And the second one on the 61st day. V'im Gilachet HaRishona Yom Shloshim. Migalechet HaShniya Yom Shishim. V'im Gilach Yom Shishim Chaser Echad Yatsa. So this is actually very interesting. In other words, the first part of the Mishnah is what we just had. So you took 2 consecutive Stam Nazirut. Each one's 30 days. So you're supposed to cut your hair on the 31st day, but if you cut your hair on the 30th day, that's okay. You brought your sacrifices, cut your hair on the 30th day, that's okay. And then you start the second one. So the second one is another 30 days. And the Mishnah says, so then you would cut, if you did that, you would cut your hair again on the 60th day, okay? Right? But if you cut your hair on the 59th day, it also works. Now, how could that be? That you cut your hair on the 59th day, it works? So it works. This is actually quite fascinating, and it comes up as a practical matter in terms of mourning, in terms of Avelut. Because Mitzat Hayom Kikulo, okay, so someone is sitting Shiva, and they get up in the morning of the 7th day. But we know that Shiva is in different periods of mourning. There's Shiva, there's also Shloshim. Also in mourning, we have the 30-day period of mourning. And there too, by the way, since one of the prohibitions of the 30 days of the mourner is not to take a haircut, or not to shave, take a haircut. So there too, we have the 30-day amount of time, parallel to the Nazir. But now the question is the following. Let's say the following case. Suppose somebody sitting Shiva, and the Shiva ends Erev Yontif. The Shiva ends, say Yontif is Shabbos, and the Shiva ends Friday. The last day of Shiva is Friday. So the person gets up, the morning gets up Friday morning. Right. But now the question is the following. What about Shloshim? What about the period of 30 days? So it's like this. So when does the period of 30 days start, actually? I mean, it counts the Shiva, but when did you start the Shloshim period, which is after Shiva? So the question is, did you start it? Maybe you start on Shabbos, because Friday is still the 7th day. True, you can get up early on the 7th day. Okay, that's Mitzat Yom Kikulo, but it's the 7th day. Or no, do we say once you have Mitzat Yom Kikulo and you can get up, you've started the Shloshim? And then take self-correction. not Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif, not Erev Shabbos. It's Erev Yom Tov. The next day is Yom Tov. Next day is Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Because we know that if you're sitting Shiva, and then the holiday comes, Yom Tov comes, Shiva's over. And if you're into Shloshim and the holiday comes, Shloshim's over. But now the question is, what happens if Erev Yom Tov was the seventh day? So we say Miksat Yom Kukulo, but did you start Shloshim? So that's the question. Did you start Shloshim or not? We tend to be lenient and say, yes, you did start Shloshim. And that's what the Mishnah seems to say over here, that if you shaved on the 30th day, then the 59th day counts as the 30th day, because the 30th day that you shaved is the beginning of your next Nazirite vow. So Miksat Yom Kukulo, then, it's actually very interesting. There's a double leniency in Miksat Yom Kukulo. One is you get up early, you stand up ready, you leave the Shiva's, in a sense, over on the seventh day before the day is completed. But then, if one sees the Shiva as over, then, as in the language of the Talmud, Yom Shavi Ole Elokanu Elkan. That's a dispute in the Talmud, actually, whether that's true or not. But our Mishnah seems to suggest exactly this, that the second 30-day period would begin on the same day, 30th day, where you completed your Nazirite vow. So just to make the point over here, that, I mean, apart from it's inherently very interesting, Miksat Yom Kukulo, that applies to the Nazir. So it sounds like the Nazir is counting out the days, actually. So what it sounds like. But I just wanted to point out that some of these principles that emerge from Mishnah in the Masechet Nazir, we wouldn't automatically connect it to the laws of Avelut that appear in a completely different tractate, Moed Katan. But there are commonalities throughout the Mishnah. And of course, the Talmud is all about suggesting all kinds of commonalities and making distinctions. Okay, so let me stop. So this is what I want to say about Stam Nazirut. That Stam Nazirut, as opposed to 30-day Nazirut, where I specify 30 days, there's a very big practical difference between them. When does it end, actually? If I said 30 days, you have to complete the whole 30 days. But if it's Stam Nazirut, no. Then the default is it ends on the 30th day before the day is completed. Okay, let me stop here for a moment before we continue with a different question that was raised last week. If there are any comments or questions on anything we've said so far, please speak up.
And people in the chat, that includes you.
Yes?
What if the opposite? Let's say I started to be a Nazir, I put in for the full time, and then at some point I decide, I really want to extend it. Do I have to end it? If I start up and say I'm going to be for 30 days, that's my neder. And then I say, I think I want to do it for the whole year. Am I bound by that first vow, or can I extend it without the chiyuv of the korban?
No, I think you're bound by the first one. I don't think you can simply extend it. There is a case, actually, you raised an extremely interesting question. There is one case pointing to some commentaries, not where you're extending where your own vow gets extended for other reasons, but it's a complicated case. Maybe we'll come back to it. But the simple answer would be, once you take the vow of 30 days, that's it. And if you want to extend it, that's a new vow. You can't just simply extend it in the middle of the vow. There is one possible case where a second vow, where the two vows can sort of merge, according to some commentaries. It's not the main position, but we'll have to leave this for now. But let me come back to something you suggested last week, Cafe. But before that, are there any other comments or questions about anything we've seen here so far? Okay, let me just let's see, find this over here. Let's take a look at the fourth chapter, okay? Let's look at the fourth chapter. This is two Mishnayot. This is something I mentioned last week, and I think this is quite interesting. It's the last two Mishnayot of chapter 4. That is chapter 4, Mishnah number 6, and chapter 4, Mishnah number 7. Okay. Before I read this Mishnah, we'll start it now, and hopefully we'll get into it. The Mishnah, these two Mishnayot are very interesting for any number of reasons. I'll get to it. But I want to make another point about Nazir, which is this. Generally speaking, the Mishnah at least understands that, at least the Talmud understands the Mishnah to be saying that a minor, katan, is not responsible for what the katan does. Perhaps the parents have a responsibility to teach the katan, but a katan is patur from mitzvot, and a katan cannot actually create, in and of themselves, create, say, obligations. The katan is patur when you become bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, when you become a person who is obligated, a person who can create things, can buy and sell, etc. That's as a general rule. Now, what does it mean to be a gadol or a katan? So typically, it's simanim and shanim. It means puberty, and for a girl, be 12 years old, and for a boy, 13 years. That's general rule. That's general rule as the Talmud understands the Mishnah. Whether the Mishnah actually meant that or not is a very important question, but some have argued, Professor Gilad argued that in the plain Mishnah, not necessarily so. But certainly in our tradition, the Talmud takes it this way: a katan is patur. A katan can't create any kind of obligation. The exception to the rule, is what is called a mufle hasamuch le'ish. Mufle hasamuch le'ish. Now, what does it mean, mufle hasamuch le'ish? So mufle is from the word in the Torah, ki yafli. The Torah says about the Nazir, ish o isha ki yafli lindar neder Nazir, a man or woman who was yafli, who was pronouncing, who was making a statement to become a Nazir. Now, as we spoke about from day one, the Nazir, it's called neder Nazir, the vow of the Nazirite, and the assumption of the Mishnah is that Nazir is an example of the larger principle we call neder. In fact, in this section of the Mishnah, this Tractate Nidarim, and the Tractate after Nidarim is Nazir. The Gemara assumes that a mufla samach le'ish can take a neder. What is a mufla samach le'ish? So it means, let's say 1 year before you would normally be a gadol. That is, for a girl, instead of 12 years old, it would be 11 years old. And for a boy, instead of 13 years old, it would be 12 years old. So that's something specific to vows. The standard of being a gadol for vows differs from the standard in Kol HaTorah Kula, and this would apply to Nazir, because Nazir is in fact a neder. I didn't mention that the first class, but it's important to being a neder has all kinds of other implications, and that is you can take a vow, and according to most authorities, has a real status from the Torah. It's no Torah halacha that a 12-year-old boy, 11-year-old girl can take a vow, and the vow was actually binding upon them. Whether they would be responsible for violating the vow is a good question, because we don't punish minors. And in all other areas of the Torah, they are minors. So they wouldn't be held accountable for that, at least not until they are 12 or 13, depending on boys or girls. But that is the principle. Fine. That's an interesting principle. And now we come across a Mishnah, and this tractate has all kinds of interesting things in it. But I thought these next two Mishnayot are interesting for a couple of different reasons. This is chapter 4, Mishnah number 6. It says the following: Ha'ish madir et beno banazir, v'yein ha'isha maderet et beno banazir. Says the Mishnah, a remarkable statement. A man can impose a vow of a Nazirite vow upon his son, but the woman cannot impose a Nazirite vow upon her son. And now the Mishnah will explain. Of course, when you read this line in the Mishnah, you sort of scratch your head and say, that's strange, because the only example we have of a person imposing a Nazirite vow upon their child is the story in chapter 1 of the book of Samuel, the story of Hannah. The Mishnah assumes, by the way, in Tractate Nazir, that Shmuel was in fact a Nazir. Hannah said, no razor shall cut his hair. And the Mishnah of Tractate Nazir itself assumes that Shmuel was a Nazir. In fact, Shmuel is mentioned in the Mishnah, and not in any old Mishnah in Tractate Nazir, but in a rather significant Mishnah in Tractate Nazir, which is the last Mishnah. The last Mishnah of this tractate, the very last Mishnah, is in what, chapter 9, Mishnah number, what is the last one? Chapter 9, Mishnah number 8. Nazir haya Shmuel, kedivrei Rabbi Nahoroi, shenemar mora lo yalel rosho, nemar b'shimshonu mora, v'nemar b'shmuel mora, ma mora mora b'shimshon Nazir, af mora mora b'shmuel Nazir. Right. So the first view of Rabbi Nahoroi is that Shmuel was a Nazir. And the Mishnah proves that from parallel language between Shimshon and Shmuel. It is rather striking that the last Mishnah of this tractate mentions Shmuel, the great prophet Samuel. And that would seem to, once you think about, I don't think it's an accident that the Mishnah waited to the last Mishnah to tell us that Samuel was a Nazir. Because Shimshon, the Mishnah sees as problematic. Avshalom is problematic. But Shmuel, for the Mishnah, is not problematic at all. He's a great prophet. So you see, you can be a great prophet, both a prophet and a Nazirite. In any event, Shmuel was a Nazir, fine. And that story of when Shmuel was a Nazir, did he take a vow, a Nazirite vow upon himself? Doesn't sound that way. Sounds like his mother says, Hannah's prayer. If you give me the child, I'll dedicate my child to God. Umoro lo yalel rosho. So the point is that the Mishnah is against this. Says the Mishnah, a woman cannot impose a Nazirite vow upon her son. But a man can impose a Nazirite vow upon his son. That's the Mishnah. Okay, fine. Ketzad. One might raise the question, a much more broader question about all the Mishnayot. Does the Mishnah have any particular views about women as opposed to men? Well, that's a good question, actually. But let's leave that out for now. I'm not sure of the answer myself, but let's leave it out. Ketzad. Now the Mishnah asks the question, Ketzad, how so? How does this work? So, Gilach oshel gilchu krovav, micha oshemichu krovav, haitelo beima mufreshet, hachatat tamut, v'olah tikrav olah, v'ashlamim yikru shlamim, v'nechalim yom echad, v'enan tunin lechem. Fine. Well, what does this mean? The Mishnah says the following. A man is permitted to impose the Nazirite vow upon his child. But the continuation of the Mishnah is very simple. Ketzad, you think Ketzad would mean, how so? How does the father impose a Nazirite vow upon his son? But that's not what the Mishnah seems to be saying. Ketzad means, what do you do if in fact the son shows that he's not interested? Not just the son shows that he's not interested, or the relatives. So the Mishnah says, it's very funny construction in the Mishnah. The father can impose a Nazirite vow upon his son, but it doesn't mean the son has to accept. The son could be 6 years old, you know. The son doesn't have to accept, and not just the son doesn't have to accept. Apparently, other relatives can step in and say, no way, no way. So what happens if the child or relatives, micha, or michu krova, they protest? So what are you going to do? In the case where the animals were set aside for the Nazirite vow, remember that at the end of the Nazirite vow, the Nazirite brings 3 animals as sacrifices: a sin offering, a chatat, a burnt offering, an olah, and a peace offering called the shlamim. So what do you do with now you have these 3 animals set aside, and the Mishnah says, what do you do with the animals? Because the animals were set aside for the vow of the Nazirite, but the kid ain't a Nazirite. So what do you do with the animals? So the Mishnah says, well, with the sin offering, it's nothing you can do. If you have a chatat, and now that chatat becomes invalid, then you have to let it die. You can't do anything with the animal. You can't sacrifice it, tamut. When it comes to the burnt offering, the olah, Bring it as a voluntary offering, because you can volunteer to bring a burnt offering. And the same thing with the shlamim. You can bring a shlamim. But it's only eaten, the Mishnah continues, you only eat the shlamim for one day, and you don't bring any bread with it. See, if we have to get into this, the sacrifices that the Nazir brings, the 3 sacrifices, the shlamim is an interesting sacrifice. It doesn't exactly conform to the typical carbon shlamim that is brought, generally speaking, in 2 ways. A normal carbon shlamim is eaten for 2 days and 1 night, but the Nazir's carbon shlamim is only for 1 day and 1 night. And second of all, when the Nazir brings the shlamim, it's brought together with 20 loaves of bread. Normally, the shlamim has no bread brought with the shlamim, except for one example. The Toda, the Thanksgiving offering, has 40 breads. Okay, so that's not a problem right now. Fine. What about if the money that was set aside for the sacrifices was not for specific sacrifices, but there's, presume the father put money in the bank, this $100 is going to be for the sacrifices, or whatever the amount is. Yiplu in a dava, then the money can be given away for the dava, to the temple as a gift. And from them, they're going to bring sacrifices. But what about if he specified the money? The money was specified, this for the this for the burnt offering, this for the sin offering. If he specified to make chatat, then if you have the money for the sin offering, you have to throw it away, and you can't get benefit from it. And the money for the burnt offering is brought Yaviu Allah, and for the shlamim, same way, it's brought as a carbon shlamim. Now, first of all, leave out the stuff with the sacrifices, which is actually quite interesting. You know, what we had a lot of time to learn together. We get into this. We're not going to be able to get into everything. But here you have a very interesting idea. Here, what strikes me anyway, is that clearly the book of Shmuel makes it very clear that a woman can impose a vow of Nazir upon her child. That's what's clear to me. And it's very unclear that the man can impose this upon his child. It's not clear to me that Chana's husband, Elkanah, has very little to do with Chana's vow. Quite the opposite. He said to her before she took a vow, don't bother because I love you more than 10 children. So give up on your dreams. So it's unclear. What is perfectly clear is that the woman can impose the vow of Nazirite vow upon her child. The Mishnah has exactly the opposite. Now we have to think, why would the Mishnah go in the other direction? But the Mishnah has the opposite. That's number one. Number two, you have another quite amazing halacha over here, that the child can protest. And it sounds like the protest of the child is when the child's a child, 6 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old. And not only that, other relatives can step in and block the father from imposing the vow. We don't really have this. You know what? We have a similar halacha, actually. We have a similar, but it's not the same at all. We have the similar halacha in a different tractate, Tractate Yevamot. There, according to the Torah laws, the Mishnah understands it, a man can marry off his daughter when she's a minor. That's the way that the Torah assumes this, and the Mishnah assumes it. What about, though, if the father dies? So only the father can marry off his daughter, but the mother and the other relatives can't do that. So the Mishnah says that it's true they can't do it on the Torah level, but they are allowed to do it. We permit them to do it. The presumption being that, I guess maybe in those societies it was a given, and maybe the way to protect the daughters, there's many ways to explain it. So it doesn't accord with our sensibilities today, marrying off your 5-year-old daughter, but it doesn't matter. So they can do it. But when the girl grows up and now is 12 years old, she can protest. It's called Kiddushay Milun. And if she protests, I don't want this guy. They've been married for 5 years. I don't really like him. And then the marriage is annulled retroactively. It's as if she's never married. It's not like getting a get. They were married and divorced. She, in a sense, uproots the entire thing to begin with. So there we have something like that. It's called Kiddushay Milun. But that's where there's no father involved. In the Mishnah over here, there is a father, and still the child or the relatives can say, I don't want it. And then the money that was set aside for the sacrifices of the Nazir, what do you do with this money, or the animals? Then the Mishnah is concerned what to do with the animals, etc. So this is one example of where the Mishnah, I would say quite intentionally, seems to go against the plain reading of the Bible, where Chana actually imposes the vow upon her child. That's Mishnah number 6. Let me just take one more Mishnah, and I'll stop and take comments and questions. And maybe we'll have to start next week, but let me just say the following. The next Mishnah, which is the last Mishnah of chapter 4, has a very, very interesting halacha. It says, "Ha'ish megaleach al nazirut aviv." You can have a case where a child, megaleach here does not mean to shave. It actually means to bring the sacrifices. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the word megaleach is code. Yes, you shave at the end and cut your hair at the end of the nazirut, but it means you bring the sacrifices. So the Mishnah says that under certain circumstances, the child can bring the Nazirite sacrifices that his father set aside, presumably for himself. Now, the Mishnah will discuss what is the case over here. What is the case? There are two possible cases over here. But one possible case is this. I'll have to maybe pick this up next time. Before we only have 2 more weeks on this, and there's tons of stuff to do. I'm trying to give everybody a taste. So one possibility is like this: the father and the son were both Nazirites. They're both Nazirim. And then the father had set aside sacrifices for his own Nazirut. And now the father dies. So we have these sacrifices. The previous Mishnah said if someone dies, or the Nazirut doesn't take place, what do you do with the animals? The sin offering dies. If there's money, it's thrown away. The burnt offering and the shlamim are eaten as voluntary sacrifices. But this Mishnah seems to suggest one possibility in the Mishnah is that in this case, they're both Nazirim, that the son in fact can bring the sacrifices of his father. So in a sense that the son somehow is inheriting in some sense, the son inherits the Nazirut of his father. I want to discuss this because of what we had seen earlier, namely that the Nazir is somebody, at least I argued, somebody who actually is not following in his father. A Nazir, by definition, is one who breaks away. He's a Nazir. Doesn't go to his father's funeral. It's about breaking away. It's about being separating. The Nazir is separate. And one of the examples of the Nazir Olam, as the Gemara understands the Mishnah, was Avshalom. He surely was not following in his father's footsteps. That is to say, he wasn't continuing his father's kingship. He wants to overthrow his father and take over. So the idea of the Nazir as one who's separate in terms from society, doesn't drink wine, which is a social drink, doesn't go to funerals, not even his own parents. That's what I think emerged from the plain reading of the Bible. But this Mishnah actually is suggesting something very curious, that in a certain sense, at least if the father's a Nazir, that Nazirut can be passed down in some way from father to son. So I want to pick up with this idea next week. These 2 mishnayot at the end of chapter 4 are interesting in terms of parents and children. And the Mishnah may be trying to make some kind of a connection between parents and children when it comes to Nazir, even though in the Bible, it's clear that the Nazir breaks away from his parents. Shimshon is a good example. The parents say, listen, what do you want to marry the Philistine? He doesn't tell them, this is the one I want, this is the one I need. He doesn't tell his parents anything. He keeps them in the dark completely. But in the Mishnah, there is at least some attempt, I think, in the Mishnah to connect the generations. I'll stop here. If any comments or questions, please speak up, and we'll pick up with this next week. And then we have 2 more weeks. I do want to talk about the other thing that Faye raised last week about the Nazir and the Kohen Gadol. And then, of course, 1 week we have to spend on what are the prohibitions of the Nazirite, which is chapter 6. There's a ton more here, but yes, who's that, Faye? Go Go ahead.
Speak
So
up.
one question is, can a woman become a Nazir according to the Mishnah? If she
Of
can't,
course, the Torah says, Isha Wisha.
okay,
Woman
And-
could certainly be a Nazir. Can she impose it upon her child? The Mishnah seems to say no, she can't. Which is remarkable since the Bible says, of course she can. The Mishnah is going its own path for whatever reason. I mean, I have a theory I mentioned last week about what the Mishnah might be suggesting. We'll pick up the Mishnah next week. We'll start with this, then we'll jump to the prohibitions of the Nazirite in chapter 6, and then we'll talk about the chapter of Kohen Gadol and Nazir, which is chapter 7. And we'll have to, this is just a taste, actually. But, you know, as I said in the beginning, the study of Mishnah is something which actually gives one a big picture about the oral tradition. And it's much more accessible than the Gemara. And it really, I mean, maybe that's where the Rambam starts with the Mishnah. The Rambam wrote a commentary on the whole Mishnah as a very young person. And then he writes the Mishnah Torah. All right, I'll stop at this point then. If anybody has other questions, you can always email me, dsilber@risha.org. And welcome any comments or questions. All right, thank you. Till next week, we will continue. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to
Thank
see
you. It was great.
And if people want to learn more with Risha, we have another class today, Conversations on the Parsha, this week on Emor with Rabbi Leah Sarna and a special guest, Rabbi Sarah Wolkenfeld. And if you want to learn more with Rabbi Silber, he will be teaching this Sunday morning at 10 a.m. also on Zoom.
Thanks so much.
Take care, everyone.